prophet of doom. Economic Armageddon.
Property prices 40 to 45% down.
These terms and concepts, they get us every time.
End of 2022, we finally saw that first crash.
Every boom has to have a bust to follow.
Every great boom has an end.
They click with our deepest fears and beliefs, and all of a sudden, we're down the rabbit hole. For example, many Australians fear that they won't be able to retire comfortably, and some younger people fear they won't be able to buy a home to live in and will be an impoverished renter for the rest of their lives. The doomsdayers can make it feel so real, and that's because they're tapping into these deep-seated fears that a lot of us share. That doesn't make them right though. Unfortunately, by the time we've gone down the rabbit hole, it's too late to turn back, and now we've got this tunnel vision we've got to live with. The truth is, history has proven that these guys rarely have a high degree of accuracy, and putting all your financial eggs in their basket is hence problematic. To prove this, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1979, and this book I found in an op shop, How to Prosper During the Coming Bad Years, a crash course in personal and financial survival. In this video, we're going to take a look at why this book is relevant now, because that's really important. After all, it's been 45 years. We're going to look at what the coming bad years were that this guy predicted, what he got wrong and what he got right, and the lessons we can take from this when it comes to making our own financial decisions. To get an idea of why this book is relevant now, we first need to get an understanding of what the economic environment was at the time.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
In 1971, Richard Nixon removed the US dollar from the gold standard. Prior to 1971, the amount of US dollar notes that could be printed was restricted because you could go back to the US government and trade your US dollar notes for gold. In the previous decade, America had been busy printing too much money, much more than the gold they held, which ultimately led to the French President Charles de Gaulle famously calling the US out. From that point in 1971, it gave America a license to print money. When money is printed, you get inflation. You can see this on the long-term graph that inflation really started moving up from the mid-60s all the way up to 12.4% in mid-1974. On a slight side note, what's really interesting is to see this wave here, and what happened is that central banks thought they had inflation beaten, so they lowered interest rates. They obviously lowered rates too fast, and that is what you can see here in this second wave of inflation, which has peaked out at 14.73% in 1980. Remember, this book was published in 1979. It would be a fair argument to make that there was much more economic uncertainty back then. They'd had 15 years of rising interest rates. To give you some perspective, we've had 2.
Buy low, sell high. Now, remember, you heard it here first.
What was Howard Ruff's predictions? Author Howard Ruff's predictions are best summarized in this quote from the book. The purpose of this book is to persuade you that the United States is about to enter its greatest test period since the Civil War, an inflationary spiral leading to a depression that will be remembered with a shudder for generations. Well, that didn't happen. By the time people bought the book and they would have read this bit about inflation, it would have already been past its peak. From this point, he couldn't have been more wrong. He goes on to write, and whoever is president of the United States and presides over the collapse will be the Hoover of the 70s and the 80s, and the opposing party will be running against him for the next 50 years. Clearly Ruff was wrong here. I can only try and put myself in his shoes and try to comprehend the mass level of uncertainty that had been happening over a long period of time. I guess the more important question here is, was his investment calls right? Because at the end of the day, maybe he still got the calls right. Let's look at Ruff's recommendations, which is the cornerstone of the book, and from there we can form an understanding of his investments. In the book, he explains recommendation 1 after explaining all the other recommendations, so we're going to take you through the same process. Spoiler alert, he does go full cougar. Ruff's recommendation number 2, have 1 bag of junk silver coins per person, and if possible an equivalent amount of gold coins for your survival position. I can understand the sentiment here, because if notes were worthless, then people would only recognize real money, which is gold and silver. Ruff's recommendation number 3, avoid unsound debt while using sound leverage for safety and profit. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I believe people are overlooking the debt risk. I think this recommendation is timeless. For the investors out there, take this classic quote from page 123. Use borrowed money only to purchase income-producing investments. Ruff's recommendation number 4, sell or trade all big city or suburban real estate and invest in small town income property. Move if possible. He had this theory that all big cities were dying and people should move away. In terms of real estate values, that one was wrong. Ruff's recommendation number 5, prepare for price controls and a black market inflationary economy. He really thought things were going to fall to pieces, and that was exemplified in Ruff's recommendation number 1, store enough food for 1 year. So basically he thought shit was going to hit the fan, so you should buy some land and learn to live off it because we're heading into total breakdown of society. The reason I read this 45-year-old book is to understand why did he make these predictions and what can I learn from this perspective. There's one thing that I've learned about Howard Ruff through researching the book, and that is that he isn't stupid. So why did he make these predictions? This is one of the most important things to take from the book because a lot of them are the exact same arguments we have today, 45 years later. We want to avoid another Great Depression or deflation. The Great Depression was horrible. Part of the problem of the Great Depression was the governments had printed and borrowed from elsewhere to fund a war in Europe and then to rebuild it. After a time, debt burdens became too much, somewhere in the system which caused debt or money to stop circulating. The whole reason Nixon removed the US dollar from the gold standard was to be able to print more money. So why not do it and avoid another Great Depression? No one saw Paul Volcker coming. He was the Federal Reserve Bank chairman and famously jacked up interest rates to the moon, solving the inflation problem for once and for good. Unfunded obligations. This is a measure of how much debt they have. The Social Security system has approximately $4 trillion in unfunded obligations. The same arguments are happening today, but with some estimated figures of unfunded obligations to be north of $160 trillion. That's 40 times more than 1979. House prices are too high. All of us Aussies have been exposed to this one. At the time, in the US, house prices did go down, accounting for inflation. However, we all know what's happened since then. I'm sure all of these arguments would have made sense at the time. The thing is, history didn't pan out this way, and if you followed all this guy's recommendations, would it have led you to a better place? Probably not.
We'll see $1,500 to $2,000 an ounce gold sooner or later.
In fact, one of his main recommendations was to hold gold, but that didn't do anything. The value spiked a little bit around the time he wrote the book, but it really didn't go anywhere until the early 2000s. To give you an idea, in that time, the S&P 500 was up about 675%, and I'm taking that off the post-dot-com crisis bubble low. Why we can't rely on these doomsday predictions alone. The more time I've spent around finance, business, investments, and property, the more skeptical I've become. At first you get more skeptical about things like good investments or good business ideas you get pitched. But then, like many of my viewers, your awareness changes and you become more skeptical of the system. This is a dangerous point in time because as you learn to be more skeptical, you can easily get captured by particular points of view like the ones expressed in this book. In my experience, I've learned that you should be skeptical of everything because that's what gets you closer to the truth. Looking at it from a personal investment perspective, you're trying to identify risks, which in my opinion makes you a better investor. If you've watched to this point, I want to say thank you. Please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I do read them and I do respond. I'd also like to invite you to My Personal Economy. It's a project community I'm working on and it's aimed at helping people make it financially. Furthermore, I know tackling these issues are difficult. Because you're still watching, I'm offering you a no obligation chat about your position. I'm not here to sell you anything or anything like that. I'm just really passionate about personal finance. My calendar link is in the description. If you want to keep watching me, you might want to watch this video I did on property market predictions. Cheers.